In the autumn of 1938, Heinrich Himmler ordered the construction of a new concentration camp approximately 50 miles north of Berlin, near the small town of Fürstenberg in the Mecklenburg Lake District. The location was chosen for its relative isolation and its proximity to existing rail lines that could facilitate the transport of prisoners. The camp was to be built on the shores of Lake Schwetzsee, in a region of forests and marshland that would make escape difficult and discourage civilian observation of camp operations. Unlike the concentration camps already operating throughout Germany and Austria, this facility would serve a specific purpose within the expanding SS infrastructure. It would house exclusively female prisoners. The site was named Ravensbrück, after the nearby village of Ravensbrück, which itself took its name from the ravens that populated the surrounding woodlands. Construction began in November 1938, using male prisoners transferred from Sachsenhausen concentration camp as forced labor. The initial compound was relatively small, designed to hold approximately 3,000 women, though this capacity would prove inadequate within the first year of operation. The camp layout followed standard SS architectural principles established by Theodor Eicke, the inspector of concentration camps who had developed the systematic brutality that characterized the camp system. Ravensbrück consisted of wooden barracks arranged in rows, surrounded by a high wall topped with electrified wire. Guard towers positioned at intervals provided surveillance over the entire compound. Administrative buildings, SS quarters, and workshops were constructed outside the main prison area. The camp officially opened on May 15, 1939, when the first transport of women arrived from Lichtenberg, an older camp in Saxony that was being closed and whose female prisoners needed relocation. The initial prisoners were predominantly German women classified by the Nazi regime as political enemies, asocials, or criminals. Political prisoners included communists, socialists, and members of religious groups such as Jehovah's Witnesses who refused cooperation with Nazi authorities. Women classified as asocial included those the regime deemed morally deficient, prostitutes, homeless women, and those accused of refusing work or maintaining relationships with men considered racially undesirable. A smaller number were designated as criminals, though this category was applied inconsistently and often included women whose only crime was resistance to Nazi policy. Each prisoner category was identified by a colored triangle sewn onto their striped prison uniform: red for political prisoners, black for asocials, green for criminals, and purple for Jehovah's Witnesses. Jewish women, who began arriving in larger numbers after 1942, wore a yellow triangle superimposed over another colored triangle to form a six-point star. The camp was administered by the SS Death's Head units, the special formations tasked with operating the concentration camp system. The first commandant was Max Kogel, an SS officer who had previously served at Dachau and Columbia House. Kogel established the disciplinary framework that would govern Ravensbrück throughout its operation: absolute obedience to SS orders, harsh collective punishment for individual infractions, and a daily routine designed to dehumanize prisoners through exhaustion, hunger, and systematic humiliation. Under Kogel's administration, Ravensbrück developed its distinctive characteristic: the extensive use of female SS guards, known as Aufseherinnen, to supervise prisoners and administer punishment. While male SS officers controlled the camp's administration and external security, female guards managed daily operations within the women's compound, conducting roll calls, supervising work details, and inflicting physical punishment. The recruitment of female SS guards represented a significant expansion of women's participation in the Nazi system of repression. Prior to Ravensbrück's opening, women had played limited roles in concentration camp operations. The establishment of a large women's camp created demand for female personnel who could conduct searches, supervise barracks, and perform tasks that Nazi racial ideology considered inappropriate for male guards to conduct with female prisoners. The SS began recruiting women through employment advertisements that described guard positions as civil service jobs offering stable wages, housing, and benefits. Many recruits came from working-class backgrounds and had limited education or employment prospects. They received brief training in camp procedures and disciplinary methods, then were assigned to Ravensbrück or one of its subcamps. The training emphasized that prisoners were enemies of the German people who deserved no sympathy or mercy. Guards who demonstrated excessive leniency faced reprimand or dismissal, while those who showed zealous cruelty were rewarded with promotions and additional privileges. The daily routine at Ravensbrück began before dawn with the sound of a gong or whistle signaling prisoners to rise from their wooden bunks. Women had minutes to dress, use the inadequate toilet facilities, and prepare for the morning roll call. Roll call, conducted in the camp's main assembly area known as the Appellplatz, required prisoners to stand in precise rows for counting. The process often lasted hours, regardless of weather conditions. Guards counted and recounted, searching for discrepancies that might indicate an escape attempt. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion or illness during roll call were beaten or dragged aside. Those who had died during the night were brought to the assembly area to be included in the count, their bodies laid in rows until the tally was complete. After morning roll call, prisoners received their first meal, typically consisting of ersatz coffee or thin soup made from turnips or potatoes. The daily food ration at Ravensbrück provided approximately 900 to 1,000 calories, insufficient for survival under the conditions of hard labor to which most prisoners were subjected. Following the morning meal, prisoners were assigned to work details. The SS operated various workshops within the camp where prisoners produced goods for German industry and the war effort. The largest and most economically significant operation was conducted in partnership with Siemens and Halske, the German electrical manufacturing firm. Beginning in 1942, Siemens established a factory complex adjacent to Ravensbrück where prisoners assembled electrical components for military applications. Thousands of women worked in the Siemens workshops, manufacturing parts for aircraft radios, telephone equipment, and other electronics. The work was physically demanding and required precision despite the prisoners' weakened condition. Production quotas were enforced through beatings and reduced food rations for workers who failed to meet targets. Siemens paid the SS for the labor of each prisoner, a fee that went into SS coffers rather than to the workers themselves. The company benefited from a workforce that could be exploited without regard for labor regulations, safety standards, or wages. Other prisoners worked in the camp's textile workshops, producing military uniforms and equipment. Women skilled in sewing operated industrial machines under supervision, stitching together garments for Wehrmacht soldiers. Those without such skills performed manual labor, sorting materials, operating looms, or preparing fabric. A separate group worked in the fur workshop, processing animal pelts confiscated from prisoners upon arrival or acquired through SS procurement networks. The fur was made into winter clothing for German troops on the Eastern Front. Additional work assignments included agriculture, with prisoners cultivating fields surrounding the camp to supplement the SS food supply, and construction, where women performed heavy labor expanding camp facilities as the prisoner population grew. The SS also operated a leather workshop, a basket weaving unit, and various maintenance operations within the camp infrastructure. A particularly brutal work assignment was the Sand Commando, a labor detail sent to excavate sand and gravel from pits near the camp. This work required prisoners to dig, load, and transport heavy materials using primitive tools and wheelbarrows. The physical demands were extreme, and the work continued regardless of weather. Women assigned to the Sand Commando suffered high mortality rates from exhaustion, accidents, and abuse by guards. The commando served partially as punishment, with prisoners who violated camp rules or displeased guards often reassigned to this detail. The work had limited productive value, but it fulfilled the SS objective of destroying prisoners through labor. Medical conditions at Ravensbrück were catastrophic from the camp's opening and deteriorated progressively as the prisoner population expanded beyond the facility's capacity. The camp infirmary, known as the Revier, was chronically understaffed and lacked basic medical supplies. Prisoner doctors, many of whom were physicians arrested for political activities or racial reasons, attempted to provide care with virtually no resources. The most common medical problems were malnutrition-related diseases including edema, dysentery, and typhus. Infectious diseases spread rapidly through the overcrowded barracks, where women slept on three-tiered wooden bunks with insufficient bedding and no privacy. Tuberculosis was endemic, and respiratory infections were common due to the drafty wooden barracks and inadequate clothing during winter months. Prisoners with serious illnesses often received no treatment and were left to die in their bunks or in a separate barrack designated for the dying. The camp's medical facilities were also the site of criminal experiments conducted by SS doctors. Beginning in 1942, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician and a senior SS medical officer, used Ravensbrück prisoners as subjects for research ostensibly designed to benefit German military medicine. The experiments focused primarily on surgical techniques for treating combat wounds and infections. In one series of experiments, doctors deliberately inflicted wounds on the legs of healthy prisoners, then contaminated the wounds with bacteria, wood shavings, and glass fragments to simulate battlefield injuries. The objective was to test the effectiveness of sulfonamide drugs in treating gas gangrene and other infections. Prisoners subjected to these experiments suffered intense pain, permanent disability, and in many cases death from infection or complications. The experiments were conducted without anesthetic and without the consent of the subjects, who were selected arbitrarily from the general prisoner population. Another set of experiments involved bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration. Doctors removed sections of bone and muscle tissue from prisoners' legs to study healing processes and to practice surgical techniques for transplanting tissue. These operations left victims permanently crippled and in chronic pain. Some prisoners were subjected to both types of experiments over extended periods. The experiments violated every principle of medical ethics and international law, yet they were conducted openly within the camp with the approval of senior SS leadership. Dr. Gebhardt supervised the program, assisted by other SS doctors including Dr. Fritz Fischer and Dr. Herta Oberhuser, one of the few female doctors involved in concentration camp medical crimes. The experiments continued until 1943, when changes in military medical priorities and growing awareness of the program's ethical violations led to its termination. Polish women comprised a significant portion of the experimental subjects, particularly those involved in the surgical experiments. Many of these women were members of the Polish resistance who had been arrested and deported to Ravensbrück. The Polish prisoners formed a distinct community within the camp, maintaining national solidarity and attempting to protect each other from SS brutality. When rumors spread that certain women were being selected for medical experiments, the Polish prisoners organized resistance efforts, hiding selected women and attempting to substitute volunteers or to protest the selections. These efforts had limited success, as the SS possessed absolute authority within the camp and could compel cooperation through threats and violence. The Polish women who survived the experiments, known as the Ravensbrück Rabbits because of their crippled gait, later provided crucial testimony about the medical crimes committed at the camp. The prisoner population at Ravensbrück expanded dramatically after Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and subsequently occupied much of Europe. Women arrested for resistance activities, partisan membership, and violations of occupation regulations were transported to Ravensbrück from across the Nazi Empire. The camp received prisoners from Poland, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Norway, and other occupied territories. This influx transformed Ravensbrück from a predominantly German camp into an international facility where dozens of languages were spoken and national groups formed distinct social structures. The diversity created both solidarity and tension. Women from different nations sometimes cooperated to resist SS oppression, sharing resources and protecting vulnerable prisoners. At other times, national prejudices and competition for scarce resources created conflict. Soviet prisoners of war began arriving at Ravensbrück in 1941 following Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. These women included soldiers captured during combat, partisans arrested during anti-insurgent operations, and civilians suspected of supporting resistance activities. Soviet prisoners faced particularly harsh treatment based on Nazi ideology that characterized Slavic peoples as racial inferiors and communists as ideological enemies. Soviet women were assigned to the most brutal work details, received reduced food rations, and were subjected to extreme disciplinary measures. Despite these conditions, Soviet prisoners organized resistance cells within the camp, maintaining military discipline and communist political education among their members. Some Soviet women attempted sabotage in the work commandos, deliberately slowing production or damaging manufactured goods. When discovered, saboteurs were executed or sent to the punishment block. The punishment block at Ravensbrück, known as the bunker, was a separate cell block used for solitary confinement and torture. Prisoners sent to the bunker were held in darkness, given minimal food, and subjected to interrogations that often involved beating and other physical abuse. The bunker served as both punishment and deterrent, its existence and the screams emanating from it reminding the general prisoner population of the consequences of resistance or rule violations. Women could be sent to the bunker for offences ranging from sabotage and escape attempts to minor infractions such as possessing contraband, failing to complete work quotas, or showing insufficient respect to guards. Time in the bunker could extend from days to months, and some prisoners died there from mistreatment or were executed after interrogation. Jewish women arrived at Ravensbrück throughout the camp's operation, though their numbers increased significantly after 1942 when the systematic deportation of European Jews intensified. Initially, Jewish prisoners came from Germany and Austria, arrested during the waves of persecution that followed Kristallnacht in November 1938 and subsequent anti-Jewish measures. After the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 formalized plans for the systematic murder of European Jewry, Ravensbrück began receiving transports of Jewish women from ghettos and transit camps. While Ravensbrück was not designated as an extermination camp like Auschwitz or Treblinka, Jewish prisoners faced particular dangers due to the Nazi ideology that classified them as the primary racial enemy. Jewish women were often assigned to the worst work commandos, received the lowest food rations, and were subjected to humiliating and degrading treatment by both guards and some non-Jewish prisoners who had absorbed anti-Semitic attitudes. Beginning in 1942, the SS established a gas chamber at Ravensbrück, a small facility initially disguised as a shower room. The gas chamber was used to murder prisoners deemed too weak for labor, those suffering from infectious diseases, and Jewish women selected during periodic selections. The killing process involved deception. Prisoners were told they were being transferred to another camp or taken to showers. They were led into the gas chamber, the doors were sealed, and poison gas was released. Death occurred within minutes. The bodies were then transported to the camp crematorium for burning. The gas chamber at Ravensbrück operated intermittently between 1942 and early 1945, and estimates suggest that several thousand women were murdered through this method. The exact number remains uncertain due to incomplete SS records and the systematic destruction of documentation as Allied forces approached in 1945. The camp also practiced murder through selection for so-called euthanasia transports. Prisoners unable to work due to age, illness, or disability were periodically selected by SS doctors and transported to other facilities for killing. Many were sent to Bernbock, one of the centers used for the T4 euthanasia program that had previously targeted disabled Germans. At Bernbock, prisoners were murdered through gas or lethal injection. The transports were presented to prisoners as transfers to convalescent facilities, but the pattern of departure without return eventually revealed the true nature of these selections. As the war progressed and Germany's military situation deteriorated, the frequency of selections increased as the SS sought to eliminate prisoners who consumed resources without producing labor value. Female SS guards at Ravensbrück exercised power with varying degrees of cruelty. Some guards conducted their duties with bureaucratic detachment, enforcing rules without excessive violence. Others displayed sadistic tendencies, beating prisoners arbitrarily and inventing pretexts for punishment. The most notorious guards became known among prisoners by nicknames reflecting their behavior and appearance. One guard was called the Beast of Ravensbrück, another was known for her practice of setting her dog on prisoners. The variation in guard behavior suggests that the camp environment and SS ideological training created conditions under which cruelty was permitted and often encouraged, but individual psychology determined the extent to which guards exploited these opportunities for violence. Dorothea Binz, one of the most feared guards at Ravensbrück, exemplified the combination of youth, limited education, and ideological commitment that characterized many female SS personnel. Born in 1920 in a small German town, Binz left school at 15 to work as a kitchen maid. She joined the Ravensbrück guard staff in 1939 at age 19, initially performing routine duties but quickly distinguishing herself through zealous enforcement of camp regulations and willingness to inflict punishment. She rose through the ranks to become deputy chief guard, second only to the head of the women's guard staff. Survivors described Binz as particularly brutal during roll calls, beating prisoners with a whip or club, for minor infractions or for no apparent reason. She participated in selections, pointing out prisoners to be sent to the gas chamber or on euthanasia transports. Her behavior represented the capacity of ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary cruelty when placed in positions of absolute power within a system that legitimized violence against dehumanized victims. The chief guard at Ravensbrück for much of its operation was Johanna Langerfeld, a Nazi party member who had previously worked at Lichtenberg. Langerfeld was responsible for supervising all female guards and managing internal camp operations. Unlike some of her subordinates, Langerfeld maintained a degree of professional distance from prisoners and occasionally intervened to prevent excessive brutality by guards under her command. However, she remained complicit in the camp's fundamental criminality, enforcing SS policies that resulted in thousands of deaths and participating in the systematic oppression of prisoners. In 1942, Langerfeld was dismissed from her position following conflicts with the camp commandant over administrative matters. She was replaced by Maria Mandl, who had previously served at Auschwitz and brought experience in managing large prisoner populations under extermination camp conditions. The camp commandants who succeeded Max Kogel maintained and intensified the regime of brutality he had established. Fritz Soren, who took command in 1942, oversaw the camp during its period of greatest expansion and highest mortality. Under Soren's administration, the prisoner population increased from approximately 10,000 to more than 40,000 by 1944, while the physical infrastructure expanded inadequately to accommodate this growth. Overcrowding became extreme, with barracks designed for 200 prisoners housing 500 or more. Bunks designed for one person held 2 or 3. The strain on sanitation, food distribution, and medical facilities became catastrophic. Surin's response to these conditions was to increase selections for the gas chamber and euthanasia transports, eliminating prisoners faster than new arrivals replaced them, but never sufficiently to alleviate the overcrowding. Women imprisoned at Ravensbrück developed survival strategies that reflected both individual resilience and collective solidarity. Experienced prisoners taught newcomers the unwritten rules of camp survival: how to avoid attracting guard attention, how to supplement inadequate rations through clandestine food acquisition, how to navigate the internal prisoner hierarchy. Women formed small groups based on nationality, political affiliation, or barrack assignment, sharing resources and providing emotional support. These groups, sometimes called families, helped members endure psychological stress and practical hardships. A prisoner who fell ill might receive extra food from her group, or others might cover for her during work assignments to prevent selection for the infirmary. The solidarity was imperfect and selective, with group boundaries sometimes creating exclusion and conflict, but it represented an essential form of resistance against the SS objective of reducing prisoners to isolated, atomized individuals. Cultural and educational activities occurred clandestinely within the camp despite prohibitions on unauthorized gatherings. Prisoners with academic backgrounds organized secret lectures on literature, history, or science, transmitting knowledge to younger prisoners and maintaining intellectual engagement as an assertion of human dignity. Women who had been musicians performed informal concerts, singing quietly in barracks during evening hours. Those who had been teachers conducted lessons for child prisoners, who began arriving at Ravensbrück in larger numbers after 1944 as deportations intensified. These activities were extremely dangerous, as discovery could result in punishment ranging from loss of food rations to confinement in the bunker or worse. The fact that prisoners continued these activities despite the risks indicates their psychological importance as means of maintaining identity and hope in an environment designed to destroy both. Religious observance provided another form of resistance and solace. Catholic prisoners held clandestine masses, with priests among the prisoner population conducting services in whispered Latin. Protestant women organized prayer groups. Jewish prisoners observed Sabbath and holidays as circumstances permitted, lighting improvised candles and reciting prayers from memory. The Jehovah's Witnesses, imprisoned for refusing military service and declining to say Heil Hitler, maintained religious study groups and continued proselytizing among other prisoners. The SS prohibited religious activities, viewing them as challenges to camp authority and expressions of loyalty to institutions outside the Nazi state. Guards who discovered religious observance responded with punishment, yet the practices continued, suggesting that spiritual life provided resources for endurance that even extreme repression could not entirely eliminate. The arrival of Allied bombing raids on German cities in 1943 and 1944 had complex effects on camp conditions. Prisoners observed the distant aircraft formations with hope, interpreting the bombs falling on German territory as evidence that Nazi power was being challenged and that liberation might eventually come. However, the raids also intensified hardship within the camp. Industrial production became more important to the German war effort as conventional factories were destroyed, increasing pressure on camp workshops to meet production quotas. Food supplies throughout Germany became more constrained, and prisoner rations decreased further. In early 1945, as Soviet forces advanced westward and approached German territory, the SS began evacuating camps in the east and transporting prisoners to camps in the interior. Ravensbrück received thousands of women from Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and other eastern camps, overwhelming the already inadequate facilities. The death rate, which had been high throughout the camp's operation, increased dramatically in the final months. The winter of 1944 to 1945 saw the camp descend into conditions approaching total collapse. Food supplies became extremely irregular, with some days passing without any distribution of rations. Prisoners subsisted on whatever they could scavenge or steal. Disease spread unchecked, with typhus epidemics killing hundreds. The infirmary ceased to function as anything resembling a medical facility, becoming merely a place where the dying were segregated from those still capable of work. The crematorium operated continuously but could not keep pace with the death rate, and bodies accumulated in piles outside the barracks. Guards became more erratic in their behavior, with some maintaining rigid enforcement of camp rules while others essentially abandoned their posts as it became clear that Germany was losing the war. In January 1945, Himmler ordered the evacuation of prisoners from camps threatened by Allied advances. From Ravensbrück, the SS organized what became known as death marches, forced evacuations where prisoners were marched on foot toward camps deeper in Germany. Thousands of women were compelled to walk westward in winter conditions, without adequate clothing, food, or rest. Guards shot prisoners who fell behind or collapsed from exhaustion. Many women died during these marches from exposure, starvation, or execution. The death marches served no rational purpose other than preventing prisoners from being liberated by advancing Allied armies, and they exemplified the Nazi commitment to murder even when military defeat was inevitable. As Soviet forces approached Ravensbrück in April 1945, the SS accelerated killing operations within the camp. Selections for the gas chamber occurred almost daily, with guards pulling women from barracks and sending them to their deaths. The SS also increased the use of execution by shooting, taking groups of prisoners to the camp wall or nearby woods and killing them. These actions served to eliminate evidence and reduce the number of potential witnesses to SS crimes. However, the killing could not proceed fast enough to eliminate all prisoners before liberation became imminent. On April 28, 1945, the SS began abandoning Ravensbrück. The remaining guards destroyed records, set fire to some facilities, and fled westward ahead of Soviet troops. They left behind thousands of prisoners too weak to walk or transport. Soviet forces reached Ravensbrück on April 30, 1945. The soldiers who entered the camp encountered scenes of mass death and human devastation. Thousands of women were alive but in conditions of extreme starvation and disease. Bodies lay unburied throughout the camp. The survivors were emaciated, many weighing less than 70 pounds, suffering from typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and injuries inflicted by guards. Soviet medical personnel immediately began providing food and medical care, though for some survivors the assistance came too late. Women who had survived years of imprisonment died within days of liberation because their bodies could not adapt to the sudden availability of food. Soviet authorities photographed the camp conditions and took testimony from survivors, documentation that would later be used in war crimes trials. The total number of women imprisoned at Ravensbrück over its nearly 6 years of operation is estimated at approximately 130,000, though precise figures are impossible to determine due to incomplete records and the SS practice of destroying documentation. Of this number, historians estimate that between 30,000 and 90,000 women died at the camp or during death marches from the camp. The wide range in estimates reflects uncertainty caused by gaps in the historical record and different methodologies for counting deaths. Some estimates include only deaths that occurred within the camp itself, while others include women who died shortly after transfer to other camps or during death marches. What is certain is that Ravensbrück was responsible for tens of thousands of deaths through deliberate murder, criminal neglect, and the systematic creation of conditions incompatible with human survival. In the months following liberation, survivors faced the challenge of recovery and returned to countries that had been devastated by years of occupation and war. Many women had no homes to return to, as their families had been killed or dispersed and their property confiscated or destroyed. Survivors from Eastern European countries found themselves in territories now controlled by the Soviet Union, where communist governments were establishing authority and where their experiences as concentration camp prisoners did not automatically grant them recognition or support. Some survivors emigrated to other countries, seeking to build new lives far from the places of their trauma. Others remained in their home countries, attempting to reintegrate into societies that often had little understanding of what concentration camp prisoners had endured and sometimes showed limited interest in hearing their testimonies. The first major trial of Ravensbrück personnel took place in Hamburg between December 1946 and February 1947, conducted by British military authorities. The trial charged 16 defendants, including Camp Commandant Fritz Soren, several SS doctors including Karl Gebhardt, and female guards including Dorothea Binz. The charges included war crimes, crimes against humanity, and murder through medical experiments, gas chamber killings, and systematic brutality. The prosecution presented testimony from survivors who described specific acts of violence and murder. Medical experts testified about the criminal nature of the experiments. The trial resulted in convictions for all defendants. Soren, Gebhardt, and several others including Binz were sentenced to death and executed by hanging in 1948. Other defendants received prison sentences of varying lengths. Additional trials of Ravensbrück personnel occurred sporadically over subsequent decades. Some guards and SS officers who had evaded immediate post-war prosecution were later identified and brought to trial in West Germany and other countries. These later trials, conducted under German law rather than by occupation authorities, resulted in mixed outcomes. Some defendants were convicted and imprisoned. Others were acquitted due to insufficient evidence or because witnesses had died in the intervening years. The legal proceedings revealed the challenges of prosecuting concentration camp crimes decades after the fact, when documentation was limited and memories had faded. The trials also exposed how many perpetrators had successfully integrated into post-war German society, living under their own names and working in ordinary occupations without facing consequences for their wartime activities. The memory of Ravensbrück evolved differently in East and West Germany, reflecting the division of the country and the different ways the two German states addressed Nazi history. Ravensbrück was located in East Germany, and the communist government established a memorial site at the camp in 1959. The memorial emphasized the suffering of political prisoners, particularly communists and resistance fighters who fit the East German narrative of anti-fascist resistance. Jewish victims and other prisoner categories received less attention in the memorial's presentation. The site included a museum, memorial sculptures, and preserved portions of the camp structure. It became a destination for school groups and official state visits, integrated into the East German political culture of remembering anti-fascist resistance while downplaying the Holocaust and the diversity of victim groups. In West Germany, Ravensbrück received less attention than concentration camps located in the western zones, such as Dachau and Bergen-Belsen. The physical distance of the camp across the border in East Germany contributed to this relative neglect, as did West German society's broader reluctance to confront the full extent of Nazi crimes during the 1950s and 1960s. Survivors living in the West published memoirs and gave lectures attempting to maintain public awareness of Ravensbrück, but these efforts reached limited audiences. The camp existed in a kind of double shadow, geographically removed from West German consciousness by the border, and narratively overshadowed by the extermination camps whose death tolls dwarfed those of individual concentration camps like Ravensbrück. International recognition of Ravensbrück's significance grew gradually through the work of survivors' organizations and historians. French survivors, many of whom had been resistance members, formed associations that preserved testimony and advocated for official recognition. Polish survivors organized similar groups, connecting with each other across Cold War divisions and maintaining relationships with the memorial site in East Germany. The publication of survivor memoirs in multiple languages brought Ravensbrück to broader international attention. Germaine Tillion, a French anthropologist imprisoned at Ravensbrück, published detailed accounts of camp life. Charlotte Delbo, a French resistance member and writer, produced a trilogy of books about her experience at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz that became recognized as significant literary testimonies. These and other survivor accounts provided the foundation for historical understanding of the camp. The collapse of East Germany and German reunification in 1990 created opportunities for reassessing the Ravensbrück Memorial and its presentation of history. The memorial was redesigned to acknowledge the full diversity of victim groups, including Jewish prisoners who had been underrepresented in the East German narrative. New exhibitions incorporated research from archives that became accessible after reunification, providing more detailed documentation of camp operations and individual prisoner experiences. The memorial also addressed the complexity of female perpetrators, examining how ordinary women became participants in mass atrocity and exploring the psychological and social mechanisms that enabled this transformation. Contemporary scholarship on Ravensbrück addresses several interconnected questions about the camp's place in Holocaust and genocide studies. The camp serves as a case study for understanding the role of women as both victims and perpetrators in the Nazi system. The female guards at Ravensbrück demonstrated that women were capable of the same cruelty as male guards in other camps, challenging assumptions about gender and violence. At the same time, women prisoners at Ravensbrück experienced specific forms of persecution related to gender, including sexual violence, forced pregnancy termination, and medical experiments focused on women's reproductive systems. The camp thus provides evidence for analyzing how genocide and mass atrocity intersect with gender in complex ways that require attention to both women's victimization and women's capacity for inflicting violence. The medical experiments at Ravensbrück also remain subjects of ethical analysis in medical education and bioethics. The experiments violated fundamental principles of medical ethics that were later codified in the Nuremberg Code and subsequent international agreements on human subjects research. The experiments demonstrated how medical professionals could rationalize criminal activity by framing it as scientific research serving national military objectives. The doctors who conducted the experiments were educated professionals with medical degrees and clinical experience, not untrained sadists. Their participation indicates how professional ethics can be corrupted when medical practice is subordinated to state ideology, and when prisoners are defined as less than fully human subjects unworthy of ethical consideration. The Ravensbrück experiments are studied alongside other Nazi medical crimes as cautionary examples in discussions of research ethics and the responsibilities of medical professionals. The experiences of survivors in the decades after liberation reveal the long-term psychological and physical effects of concentration camp imprisonment. Many survivors suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though this diagnostic category did not exist when they were first attempting to process their experiences. Survivors reported recurring nightmares, difficulty forming trust relationships, and persistent anxiety even in objectively safe situations. Physical health problems stemming from malnutrition, disease, and injuries sustained in the camp persisted throughout survivors' lives. Women who had been subjected to medical experiments lived with permanent disabilities. The delayed recognition of these lasting harms contributed to survivors' feelings of isolation, as post-war societies expected former prisoners to simply resume normal life without acknowledging the profound damage that imprisonment had caused. Survivors' testimony has been central to historical understanding of Ravensbrück, as documentation from SS sources is incomplete due to systematic destruction of records before liberation. The testimony comes in multiple forms: formal depositions given during war crimes trials, memoirs published in various languages, oral histories recorded by historical archives, and informal accounts transmitted within survivors' communities. This testimony varies in detail and reliability, reflecting differences in individual memory, the circumstances under which testimony was given, and survivors' purposes in providing accounts. Historians analyzing this material must navigate questions about memory's accuracy decades after events, about trauma's effects on recollection, and about how survivors' accounts were shaped by the contexts in which they were solicited and received. Despite these methodological challenges, survivor testimony remains indispensable, as it provides perspectives and information unavailable from any other source. The testimony reveals patterns of experience that transcend individual stories. Survivors consistently describe the shock of arrival at the camp, the dehumanizing process of registration that included head shaving and assignment of prisoner numbers, and the terror of the first roll call where the rules of the new reality were communicated through violence and humiliation. They describe the constant hunger that dominated consciousness, reducing human concerns to the search for any possible source of additional food. They describe the degradation of sanitary conditions that denied privacy and dignity, forcing women to perform bodily functions in public view under the watch of guards. They describe the deaths of friends and compatriots, sometimes sudden through violence, other times slow through disease and starvation, and the psychological necessity of emotional numbing to survive the repeated experience of loss. The testimony also documents acts of resistance and solidarity that survived in memory as sources of pride and evidence that the SS did not completely succeed in destroying prisoners' humanity. Survivors describe sharing food with those weaker than themselves, an act that involved real sacrifice when everyone was starving. They describe protecting children who arrived in the camp, organizing clandestine education and play to preserve some remnant of childhood in the midst of horror. They describe sabotaging production in workshops, slowing work pace and deliberately creating defective products as small acts of resistance against the war machine. They describe maintaining cultural and religious practices despite prohibitions, asserting identity and community against the SS effort to reduce prisoners to anonymous, interchangeable labor units. These acts of resistance were small in scale and could not prevent the fundamental reality of camp atrocity, but they represented assertions of agency and morality in circumstances designed to eliminate both. The question of how to remember and commemorate Ravensbrück continues to evolve. The memorial site preserves portions of the original camp structure, including barracks foundations, the camp wall, and the site where the gas chamber stood before being demolished by the SS before liberation. Memorial sculptures and plaques commemorate specific victim groups and recognize individuals who died in the camp. A crematorium building remains standing and is accessible to visitors as a site of witness. The museum housed in former SS buildings presents the camp's history through documents, photographs, artifacts, and survivor testimony. Educational programs bring school groups to the site, using the physical location and historical evidence to teach about Nazi crimes and the dangers of totalitarianism, racism, and unchecked state power. International commemoration occurs through annual ceremonies organized by survivors' associations, with representatives from various countries gathering at Ravensbrück to honor the dead and hear testimony from the diminishing number of living survivors. These ceremonies have taken on increased urgency as the survivor generation ages and passes away. By the 2020s, the number of living Ravensbrück survivors had declined to a handful of women, all in their 90s or older. The ceremonies increasingly involve second and third generations, children and grandchildren of survivors who carry forward the responsibility of memory and education. The particular. Significance of Ravensbrück in the broader landscape of Holocaust memory relates to its demonstration that the Nazi system of persecution and murder extended systematically to women as a distinct category of victims. While all concentration camps imprison women, Ravensbrück was unique in being designed and operated specifically for female prisoners. This specialization allowed the SS to develop methods of exploitation and murder adapted to women, including forms of forced labor that capitalized on traditional female skills such as sewing and textile production. The medical experiments conducted at Ravensbrück targeted women's bodies specifically, focusing on reproductive systems and methods of sterilization that reflected Nazi obsessions with controlling fertility and eliminating populations deemed racially undesirable. The camp also demonstrated how women participated as perpetrators in the Nazi system, complicating narratives that frame women exclusively as victims of Nazi violence. The female SS guards at Ravensbrück exercised real power and made choices about how to wield that power. While they operated within a system created and controlled by men, and while their authority was subordinate to male SS officers, they were not merely passive instruments of male violence. They made decisions about whom to beat, whom to favor with easier work assignments, whom to recommend for selections to the gas chamber. Some guards exhibited restraint and occasionally helped prisoners, while others embraced cruelty with enthusiasm. The variation suggests that individual agency existed even within the constraints of the SS system, and that the choice to inflict unnecessary suffering was genuinely a choice, not an inevitable response to institutional pressures. The post-war careers of Ravensbrück guards who escaped prosecution revealed disturbing patterns about accountability and memory. Many former guards returned to ordinary life in post-war Germany, working as secretaries, shop assistants, and homemakers. Their former positions at Ravensbrück were not generally known to their post-war communities, and they did not face social ostracism or legal consequences unless specifically identified and prosecuted. This anonymity was partly due to the chaos of the immediate post-war period, when tracking individuals across a devastated landscape was difficult, and when many Germans provided false information about their wartime activities. It also reflected a broader German reluctance to confront the extent of popular participation in Nazi crimes, a reluctance that manifested in limited prosecution of lower-level perpetrators and social acceptance of former Nazi party members who claimed to have been following orders or to have been unaware of the regime's worst crimes. The experience of Ravensbrück survivors attempting to rebuild lives after liberation was shaped by multiple factors beyond their personal trauma. The political geography of post-war Europe determined what opportunities were available for rebuilding. Survivors from Western European countries generally returned to nations that were recovering under democratic governments and Marshall Plan assistance. Those from Eastern Europe returned to countries that had been devastated by years of occupation and were now being incorporated into the Soviet sphere of influence. Polish survivors, who had constituted a large portion of Ravensbrück's population, returned to a Poland whose borders had been redrawn, whose government had been transformed, and where millions of people had been killed or displaced. Jewish survivors faced the additional challenge that their pre-war communities had been destroyed. The synagogues, schools, and neighborhoods where they had lived were gone, and the vast majority of European Jews had been murdered. Returning to former homes often meant confronting absence and loss on a scale that made reconstruction of pre-war life impossible. Survivors also faced disbelief or indifference when they attempted to describe their experiences. The scale of Nazi crimes was so extreme that people who had not experienced concentration camps directly found the accounts difficult to believe. Survivors were sometimes accused of exaggeration or met with suggestions that they must have done something to deserve imprisonment. This response, reflecting a psychological need to believe in a just world where severe punishment implies guilt, added to survivors' trauma by denying recognition of what they had endured. Over time, some survivors chose to remain silent about their experiences, finding that speaking about Ravensbrück created social discomfort, and that silence was easier than repeatedly confronting disbelief or incomprehension. The financial compensation available to survivors varied significantly based on country of residence and political status. West Germany established reparations programs that provided monetary compensation to some concentration camp survivors, though the amounts were modest and the application process was bureaucratic and often humiliating, requiring survivors to prove their imprisonment and demonstrate ongoing harm. East Germany rejected the concept of individual reparations, arguing that the socialist state's anti-fascist orientation constituted adequate recognition of Nazi crimes. Survivors living in Eastern European countries generally received no compensation from Germany, as diplomatic relations between East Germany and its socialist neighbors did not include reparations agreements, and West Germany had no diplomatic relations with most Eastern European states during the Cold War. The absence of compensation compounded survivors' material hardship and contributed to feelings that their suffering had not been adequately acknowledged. Research into Ravensbrück continued through the late 20th and early 21st centuries as historians gained access to previously closed archives and as new questions emerged about gender, memory, and perpetration. Scholars examined the economic dimensions of the camp, analyzing how Siemens and other German corporations benefited from slave labor and what degree of responsibility corporate management bore for conditions in their factory operations. This research documented that corporate representatives regularly visited the Siemens workshops at Ravensbrück, observed prisoners working, and negotiated directly with SS administrators about production quotas and labor costs. Corporate officials thus had direct knowledge of the conditions under which their products were being manufactured, and chose to continue operations that depended on exploiting concentration camp prisoners. The research contributed to debates about corporate accountability and to lawsuits in which survivors and their descendants sought compensation from companies that had profited from forced labor. Historians also investigated the recruitment and training of female SS guards, examining how ordinary women were transformed into camp guards capable of cruelty and murder. The research revealed that guard recruits received minimal ideological training, primarily through practical instruction in camp procedures and through observation of experienced guards' behavior. The absence of extensive formal indoctrination suggests that institutional context and peer pressure were more significant than ideological commitment in shaping guard behavior. New guards learned that cruelty was permitted and often expected, that sympathy for prisoners was viewed as weakness, and that advancement within the guard hierarchy rewarded zealous enforcement of camp rules. The institutional culture thus created incentives for brutality and discouraged humane behavior. The question of why some guards behaved more cruelly than others, despite sharing the same institutional context, remains a subject of analysis. Psychological research on obedience and conformity provides partial explanations, demonstrating that authority figures and group dynamics can induce ordinary people to inflict harm on others. However, these explanations do not fully account for the variation in guard behavior at Ravensbrück, where guards working under identical conditions made different choices about how to treat prisoners. Some element of individual moral character, psychological disposition, or personal history appears to have influenced whether guards embraced cruelty enthusiastically or exercised their authority with relative restraint. The historical record cannot fully explain these individual differences, but it documents their existence and their consequences for prisoners. The camp's physical site today serves multiple functions simultaneously, as memorial, as educational facility, as historical research center, and as gravesite. The grounds where prisoners suffered and died have been transformed into landscaped memorial areas with paths, benches, and explanatory markers. The transformation acknowledges that the site cannot remain exactly as it was at liberation, both because preservation requires intervention and because the site must serve contemporary pedagogical and commemorative purposes. The challenge facing memorial administrators is how to present history in ways that are respectful to victims, accurate to historical evidence, and meaningful to visitors who have no direct connection to the events. The memorial attempts this through multiple strategies, preserving authentic structures where possible, providing detailed historical information through exhibitions, presenting survivor testimony in written and recorded formats, and creating contemplative spaces where visitors can reflect on what they have learned. The number of visitors to Ravensbrück increased steadily from the 1990s through the 2010s, reflecting growing public interest in Holocaust history and increased accessibility following German reunification. School groups constitute a significant portion of visitors, as German education policy mandates teaching about Nazi crimes and encourages visits to memorial sites. International visitors come from countries whose citizens were imprisoned at Ravensbrück, making pilgrimages to honor compatriots or relatives who died there. The visitor experience includes guided tours through preserved camp areas, self-directed exploration of exhibitions, and opportunities to participate in commemorative ceremonies on significant dates such as the Liberation Anniversary. Educational programs at the memorial site emphasize not only historical knowledge about what occurred at Ravensbrück but also broader lessons about human rights, the dangers of totalitarianism, and the importance of defending democratic values. These programs engage with difficult questions about perpetration and complicity, asking how ordinary people became participants in atrocity and what this history suggests about contemporary moral responsibilities. The programs also address the specific significance of Ravensbrück as a women's camp, examining how gender intersected with other categories of persecution and how women's experiences of Nazi violence differed from men's experiences while sharing fundamental characteristics. The story of Ravensbrück remains incomplete in certain respects, limited by gaps in the historical record that cannot be filled. The exact number of women who died there will never be known with certainty. The identities of many victims remain unknown, as they arrived at the camp without proper documentation or were registered under false names or simply as numbers. The personal histories, hopes, and personalities of most prisoners exist only as absences, individuals reduced in the historical record to statistics or anonymous members of victim categories. This incompleteness is itself historically significant, representing one of the enduring harms that the Nazi system inflicted: the erasure of individual identity and the reduction of human beings to mass categories of the condemned. What can be known with certainty is that Ravensbrück was a site of systematic human rights violations on a massive scale, where women from across Europe were imprisoned, exploited, tortured, and murdered as part of the Nazi project of racial reorganization and totalitarian control. The camp operated for nearly 6 years with the knowledge and support of German state institutions, German corporations, and thousands of German citizens who served as guards, administrators, and support personnel. The victims included women of diverse nationalities, religions, political beliefs, and social backgrounds, united only by the Nazi regime's classification of them as enemies, inferiors, or obstacles to be eliminated. Some women survived to bear witness, but tens of thousands did not. Their lives ended through deliberate murder or through the creation of conditions calculated to cause death through disease, starvation, and exhaustion. The women who survived Ravensbrück carried their experiences through the remainder of their lives, some speaking publicly about what they had endured, others maintaining silence except among fellow survivors who could understand without explanation. They lived to see Germany transformed from Nazi dictatorship to divided nation to reunified democracy. They witnessed the Cold War's end and the opening of archives that provided documentary confirmation of what they had experienced directly. They saw their testimony incorporated into historical scholarship, memorial exhibitions, and educational curricula. In their final years, as the survivor generation reached the end of natural lifespans, many expressed concern about what would happen to memory when direct witnesses were no longer alive to tell their stories. The responsibility for maintaining memory of Ravensbrück now passes to subsequent generations who did not experience the camp directly but who inherit the obligation to ensure that what occurred there is neither forgotten nor repeated. This responsibility includes preserving and interpreting the historical evidence, maintaining the memorial site, supporting continued research and education, and applying the lessons of this history to contemporary challenges related to human rights, genocide prevention, and the defense of democratic values against authoritarian threats. The magnitude of what occurred at Ravensbrück demands that its memory be preserved not as abstract history but as evidence of what human beings are capable of inflicting on each other when institutional structures and ideological systems sanction violence against dehumanized others. Ravensbrück stands in the historical record as testimony to both the worst and the best of human capacity. It demonstrates the depths of cruelty that ordinary people can reach when socialized into systems that define certain human beings as unworthy of moral consideration. It shows how professional ethics can be corrupted when subordinated to state ideology, and how corporations can exploit humans suffering for profit when legal and moral constraints are removed. But the camp's history also preserves evidence of resistance, solidarity, and the persistence of human dignity under conditions designed to destroy it. Women imprisoned at Ravensbrück maintained relationships, practiced their faiths, created art, educated children, and protected the vulnerable even when doing so involved personal risk and sacrifice. These acts did not prevent the fundamental atrocity of the camp's operation, but they demonstrated that the Nazi objective of completely dehumanizing prisoners was never fully achieved. The women of Ravensbrück, both those who survived and those who perished, remain present in historical memory through the testimony, artifacts, and documentary evidence that survived the Nazi attempt to destroy all evidence of their crimes. Their experiences demand recognition and require that those who encounter this history respond with more than passive acknowledgement. The appropriate response includes commitment to defending human rights, vigilance against the ideological and political movements that enable atrocity, and support for the institutions and values that protect vulnerable populations from systematic persecution. The history of Ravensbrück is not merely past but continues to speak to the present, offering stark evidence about what becomes possible when societies abandon the principles that recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every human being.